On a spring morning in 1999, a little boy was found dead in a Georgia ditch, his body wrapped in garbage bags, and for 23 years, no one knew his name. Before we dive into this haunting story, leave a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from. And if this case stays with you, hit subscribe, because tomorrow we uncover another story that will linger long after the screen fades to black. The child was small, perhaps 40 pounds, with close cropped hair and delicate features that suggested he had once been loved by someone. His tiny frame bore the unmistakable signs of violence, bruises, and wounds that told of suffering no child should ever endure. When investigators lifted him from that roadside grave, they found nothing to identify him. No wallet, no note, no missing persons report that matched his description. He was, in every legal and practical sense, a ghost. For more than 2 decades, this little boy existed only as a case number, a designation modified for his gender, a set of photographs that aged in evidence boxes while the world moved on without him. Investigators came and went. Detectives retired. The technology that might have given him back his name was still years away from existence. But someone remembered him. Someone always does. This is the story of William DaShawn Hamilton, the boy who was lost for 23 years, and the relentless pursuit of truth that finally brought him home. To understand how a child could vanish so completely, we must first understand the world he was born into. William DaShawn Hamilton came into this world on September 19, 1992, in DeKalb County, Georgia, at Grady Memorial Hospital in nearby Atlanta. The delivery was unremarkable in the clinical sense. A healthy boy, weighing 7 pounds and 4 ounces, born to a mother who was barely out of her teens herself. His birth certificate listed his mother as Terry Hamilton, a woman whose life had already been marked by instability and struggle. His father's name was recorded as Marcus Williams, but the man would play little role in the years that followed, vanishing from the picture before William took his first steps. DeKalb County in the early 1990s was a place of contradictions. Just east of Atlanta, it was home to both middle-class suburbs with manicured lawns and pockets of grinding poverty, where families lived in cramped apartments with peeling paint and broken windows. The county's population was growing rapidly, straining social services that were already stretched thin. For families living on the margins, the safety nets that might have caught a falling child were often full of holes large enough to swallow a small boy whole. Terry Hamilton was 23 years old when William was born. She had grown up in the same county, raised by a mother named Dorothy Hamilton, who had her own demons to battle, including a history with alcohol that made her presence in her grandchildren's lives sporadic at best. The cycle of dysfunction that would eventually claim William's life had roots that stretched back generations, a twisted family tree where neglect and violence were passed down like heirlooms. Terry had dropped out of high school at 16, drifted between jobs at fast food restaurants and discount stores, and struggled with the kind of chaos that makes stable parenting nearly impossible. She had given birth to her first child at 17, a daughter named Keisha, who had been taken by Child Protective Services before her first birthday. The pattern had already been established before William was even conceived. William was not her first child, nor would he be her last. In the years before and after his birth, Terry would have multiple children with different fathers, creating a constellation of half-siblings who moved in and out of various living arrangements like pieces on a chessboard that no one was really playing. Some stayed with relatives. Others entered the foster care system, becoming numbers in a database, faces in files that grew thicker with each passing year. William, for reasons that would only become clear decades later, seemed to fall through every crack in a system riddled with them. The earliest years of William's life are shrouded in the kind of uncertainty that haunts cases like this. There are fragments of information, glimpses of a little boy who existed on the periphery of multiple households, never quite belonging to any of them. Relatives would later recall seeing him at family gatherings, a quiet child with large, watchful eyes who seemed to take up as little space as possible, as if he understood instinctively that his presence was barely tolerated. His maternal grandmother, Dorothy Hamilton, would occasionally take William for weekends, but these visits were unpredictable. Dorothy's drinking made her an unreliable caregiver, and her own apartment was barely large enough for herself. William's paternal relatives were largely absent from his life, his father Marcus having drifted away before any bonds could form. The boy existed in a liminal space, belonging to no one fully, protected by no one consistently. By the time William was 3 years old, he had already experienced more instability than most children face in a lifetime. He moved between his mother's care and the homes of various relatives, sometimes staying for weeks, sometimes for months. The reasons for these transitions varied. Sometimes Terry was working double shifts at the warehouse where she had found employment. Sometimes she was dealing with personal issues that made caring for a young child impossible. And sometimes the adults in William's life simply passed him along like an unwanted burden, a problem to be solved by someone else. In 1995, when William was 3 years old, something shifted in the family dynamic that would prove catastrophic. Terry Hamilton entered into a relationship with a man named Brian Bell. Bell was 32 years old, nearly a decade older than Terry, with a reputation in the neighborhood that preceded him like a dark cloud. He was known as someone who could be charming when he wanted to be, quick with a smile and a joke that could make you forget for a moment the hardness in his eyes. But beneath the surface, there was a darkness that those who knew him well learned to fear. Brian Bell had grown up in similar circumstances to Terry, raised in poverty by parents who had their own struggles with addiction and violence. He had dropped out of school young, had accumulated a juvenile record that included petty theft and assault, and had spent his 20s moving between odd jobs and unemployment. He had never held down a stable relationship, and the women in his past had stories they rarely told, stories of bruises hidden under long sleeves, and explanations that never quite made sense. The relationship between Terry and Brian began as these relationships often do, with intensity that felt like passion, but was really something else entirely. Brian moved into the household within weeks of meeting Terry, establishing himself as the man of the house with a speed that left little room for objection. For William, the arrival of Bell meant learning to navigate yet another adult presence, another set of rules, another potential source of danger. The couple fought frequently, their arguments loud enough to be heard by neighbors in the thin-walled apartment complex where they lived. There were allegations of domestic violence, though none that resulted in formal charges during this period. The police were called on more than one occasion by concerned neighbors, but when officers arrived, Terry always declined to press charges. She told them it was just a misunderstanding, that voices had been raised, but nothing more. The officers, facing heavy caseloads and limited resources, moved on to the next call. For William, the arrival of Brian Bell marked the beginning of a new and darker chapter in his short life. The abuse began subtly at first, harsh words and rough handling that could be explained away as discipline. Brian had strong opinions about how children should behave, opinions shaped by his own brutal upbringing. He believed in punishment, swift and physical, for any perceived transgression. And William, a small boy, who cried when he was scared and sometimes wet the bed at night, provided endless opportunities for transgression. The first time Brian hit William, Terry was in the next room. She heard the sharp crack of palm against skin, heard her son's cry of pain and fear, and told herself it was nothing. Discipline. The boy needed to learn. But the hitting didn't stop, and it didn't stay discipline. It escalated, as these things always do, from slaps to punches, from punches to kicks, from individual incidents to a sustained campaign of terror against a child who had no means of escape. The records from this period are sparse, but what exists paints a troubling picture. William did not attend preschool or any formal educational program, despite being of age for such programs. He was rarely seen by doctors, missing routine checkups and vaccinations that might have brought him to the attention of medical professionals trained to spot signs of abuse. The usual touch points that might have brought him to the attention of Child Protective Services simply did not exist. He was invisible in the way that only the most vulnerable children can be invisible, present in the world but absent from all the systems designed to protect him. There was one report, filed in late 1996, that briefly brought the family to the attention of Child Protective Services. A neighbor had noticed bruises on William's arms and face and had called in a concern. A caseworker was assigned, a young woman named Patricia Hendricks, who had been with the agency for less than 2 years and already carried a caseload of more than 40 families. Patricia visited the apartment on a Thursday afternoon, arriving unannounced as protocol required. Terry answered the door with William standing behind her, partially hidden by his mother's legs. The caseworker noted that the apartment was cluttered but not dangerous, that there was food in the refrigerator, that William appeared clean, if somewhat thin. She asked about the bruises, and Terry had an explanation ready. The boy had fallen while playing. He was clumsy, always bumping into things. You know how boys are. Patricia interviewed William briefly, but the child said little. He stared at the floor, answered questions in monosyllables, and clung to his mother's hand as if afraid to let go. The caseworker noted that he seemed shy but saw no obvious signs of immediate danger. She closed the case with a notation that the family should be monitored, but the monitoring never happened. Her caseload was too heavy, and new crises demanded her attention. William slipped back into invisibility. By 1998, when William was 6 years old, his living situation had become even more precarious. Terry Hamilton and Brian Bell had been together for several years, their relationship marked by the kind of toxic patterns that rarely improve with time. The violence had become routine, both between Brian and Terry, and between Brian and William. Neighbors had stopped calling the police, having learned that their calls never changed anything. The apartment had become a closed world, a small hell that existed behind a door that no one bothered to open. William, now old enough to understand that his home was not like other homes, had become increasingly withdrawn. The few people who interacted with him during this period would later describe a child who rarely spoke, who flinched at sudden movements, who seemed to carry a weight far too heavy for his small shoulders. When relatives saw him at occasional family gatherings, they noticed that he was thin. that he rarely smiled, that he stayed as close to the edges of rooms as possible, as if trying to disappear into the walls. His grandmother, Dorothy, during one of her sober periods, expressed concern to Terry about William's condition. "The boy looked sick," she said. "He looked scared. Something wasn't right." Terry dismissed her mother's concerns with the practiced ease of someone who had been making excuses for years. William was fine. He was just a quiet kid. He took after his father that way. Dorothy let the matter drop, returning to her own struggles, leaving her grandson to his. The summer of 1998 was hot in Georgia, the kind of oppressive heat that makes tempers short and patience thin. The apartment complex where the family lived had no central air conditioning, and the window units that rattled in some of the units were luxuries that Terry and Brian could not afford. Inside the cramped apartment, the temperature often climbed above 90 degrees, making the small space feel like an oven. Inside that apartment, the atmosphere was suffocating in more ways than one. Brian had lost another job, this time at a warehouse where he had been caught stealing merchandise. The loss of income made the household even more unstable, and Brian's frustration found its usual outlet in violence. Terry bore the brunt of his anger, but when she wasn't available, William would do. Neighbors would later recall hearing arguments through the thin walls during that summer, the sound of objects being thrown, the occasional sharp cry that could have been an adult or a child. They told themselves it wasn't their business. They told themselves that someone else would do something if it was really that bad. They told themselves the lies that people tell themselves when they want to look away from suffering. No one called the police. No one knocked on the door to check on the little boy who had become a ghost in his own neighborhood. In communities where resources are scarce and mistrust of authorities runs deep, people often look the other way. They tell themselves it is not their business. They convince themselves that someone else will do something. And so the silence becomes complicity, and children like William continue to suffer behind closed doors. As 1998 turned into 1999, William DaShawn Hamilton was approaching his 7th birthday, though he would never live to see it. He should have been in 1st grade, learning to read, making friends, discovering the world in all its wonder. Instead, he was trapped in a nightmare that no child should ever have to endure. The abuse that had been building for years was reaching a terrible crescendo, though no one outside that apartment knew it. The last confirmed sighting of William alive came sometime in early March 1999. A relative named Shanice Williams, Terry's cousin, stopped by the apartment to drop off some clothes her own children had outgrown. She recalled seeing William briefly, noting that he seemed thin and unusually quiet, more so than usual. He sat in the corner of the living room, watching a cartoon on the small television, and barely looked up when Shanice entered. When asked about William later, after his body had been found and his identity finally established, Shanice would express regret that she had not asked more questions, had not looked more closely, had not trusted her instincts that something was terribly wrong. She remembered thinking that the boy looked sick, that he seemed afraid, that there was something in his eyes that reminded her of a wounded animal. But she had not acted on those instincts. She had dropped off the clothes, made small talk with Terry for a few minutes, and left. And then William DaShawn Hamilton vanished. Not in a dramatic way, not with police reports, or Amber Alerts, or news coverage. He simply ceased to exist in the consciousness of those who should have been looking out for him. His mother did not report him missing. His relatives did not raise alarms. The schools he never attended didn't mark his absence. William slipped out of the world as quietly as he had lived in it. The date was March 15, 1999. It was a Monday, the kind of ordinary day that should have been unremarkable in every way. In DeKalb County, Georgia, morning traffic moved along the roads as it always did. Commuters drove to work, fighting through the congestion that had become Atlanta's calling card. School buses picked up children who would spend their days learning, laughing, being children. The machinery of daily life churned forward as it always had. At approximately 7:45 in the morning, a sanitation worker named Marcus Johnson was making his usual rounds along a stretch of Snapfinger Road. This was a route he had driven countless times before, a winding road that passed through a mix of residential areas and patches of undeveloped land. The morning was cool for March, the kind of early spring day that promised warmth later but still held the memory of winter in its bones. Marcus had been working for the county sanitation department for 12 years, and he had seen plenty of illegal dumping in his time. Mattresses, appliances, construction debris, sometimes the carcasses of dogs or cats that people couldn't be bothered to dispose of properly. He had grown used to the uglier aspects of his job, had developed the ability to observe without really seeing, to do his work without letting it touch him too deeply. But as Johnson slowed his truck near a drainage ditch on the eastern stretch of Snapfinger Road, something caught his eye that made him brake harder than he intended. There, among the weeds and debris that collected in such places, was a shape that did not belong. At first his mind tried to make sense of what he was seeing. A pile of garbage bags, perhaps, illegally dumped by someone too lazy to visit the landfill. But as he looked closer, his stomach began to turn. The bags were black, the heavy-duty kind used for yard waste or moving. They had been arranged with a certain deliberateness, placed rather than thrown. And from one corner, barely visible in the early morning light, something protruded that made Johnson's blood run cold. It was a small hand, a child's hand. Marcus Johnson would later describe the moments that followed as the longest of his life. He pulled his truck to the side of the road, his hands shaking so badly he could barely grip the steering wheel. For a long moment, he simply sat there, willing what he had seen to be something else. A mannequin, a doll, anything but what he knew, in his heart, it actually was. The morning sounds seemed to fade away, replaced by the roaring of blood in his ears. He had 2 children of his own at home, a boy and a girl who would be getting ready for school right about now. The thought of them, safe and loved, made what he was seeing even harder to comprehend. How could someone do this to a child? How could someone throw a child away like garbage? Finally, Marcus forced himself to step out of the truck. The ditch was perhaps 10 feet from the road, accessible by a gentle slope covered in dead grass and early weeds. He approached slowly, his work boots sinking slightly into the soft earth that had been softened by recent rain. With each step, the reality of what he was seeing became more undeniable. The garbage bags had been torn, whether by animals or by the passage of time, he could not tell. Through the tears in the plastic, he could see fabric, clothing, and beneath the clothing, the unmistakable form of a small body. Marcus did not touch anything. Some instinct, perhaps from years of watching crime shows, or simply from basic human decency, told him that this was a scene that needed to be preserved. He backed away slowly, returned to his truck, and with trembling fingers dialed 911. The call was logged at 7:52 in the morning. The dispatcher, a woman named Patricia Coleman, who had worked the morning shift for 8 years, would later say that she knew from the sound of Marcus Johnson's voice that this was different from the routine calls she handled every day. There was a quality to his words, a barely controlled panic that told her something terrible had happened. Within minutes, the first patrol car arrived, followed quickly by another. Officers Derek Thompson and Maria Santos were the first on the scene, both of them young enough that they had never encountered anything like this in their careers. They secured the area with yellow crime scene tape, keeping their distance from the body, their faces pale beneath the morning sun. More officers arrived, then detectives, then the medical examiner's van. The normally quiet stretch of Snap Finger Road became a hive of activity, patrol cars and unmarked vehicles lining both sides of the street. Neighbors emerged from nearby homes, drawn by the commotion, their faces showing the mixture of curiosity and dread that accompanies such scenes. A small crowd gathered at the edge of the crime scene tape, whispering among themselves, trying to piece together what had happened. Detective Raymond Harris was one of the first investigators to arrive. A 22-year veteran of the DeKalb County Police Department, Harris had worked homicides for the better part of a decade. He had seen victims of gunshots, stabbings, beatings. He had delivered death notifications to grieving families and sat across from killers in interrogation rooms. At 51 years old, he thought he had seen everything the job had to offer. But as he approached that ditch on Snapfinger Road, ducking under the yellow tape that marked the perimeter, he felt something shift inside him, a coldness that had nothing to do with the morning air. The child was small, impossibly small. Later, measurements would put his height at approximately 3 feet, 8 inches, his weight at around 40 pounds. He was dressed in clothes that were too big for him, a faded t-shirt with a cartoon character that Harris didn't recognize, and jeans that had been rolled up at the cuffs. His shoes were worn, the soles nearly through in places, the laces frayed and knotted. But it was the child's face that would haunt Detective Harris for years to come. Even in death, there was something about the boy's features that suggested innocence betrayed. His eyes were closed, his expression almost peaceful, as if he had simply fallen asleep and would wake at any moment. The contrast between that peaceful face and the circumstances of his discovery was almost too much to bear. Harris knelt beside the ditch, close enough to see but careful not to disturb anything. He had worked enough scenes to know the importance of preservation, of letting the forensics team do their work before anyone else contaminated the evidence. But he allowed himself this moment, this brief communion with a child whose name he did not know. "I'm going to find out who you are," he said quietly. So quietly that no one else could hear. "I'm going to find out who did this to you." It was a promise he would keep, though it would take more than 2 decades to fulfill. The medical examiner, Dr. Patricia Clemens, arrived shortly after 9 in the morning. She was a small woman with gray hair pulled back in a practical bun, reading glasses perched on her nose, and the kind of calm demeanor that came from years of working with the dead. She approached the scene with the clinical detachment that her profession required, but even she paused for a moment when she saw the child's body. In her 25 years of practice, Dr. Clemens had examined victims of every age and manner of death. She had autopsied infants who had stopped breathing in their cribs, teenagers killed in car accidents, elderly patients who had passed peacefully in their sleep, but children who had been murdered, children who had been discarded like this one, were always different. Children were always harder, The preliminary examination at the scene revealed several troubling findings. The child showed signs of severe malnutrition, his ribs visible beneath his skin, his cheeks hollowed in a way that suggested long-term deprivation. There were bruises on his body in various stages of healing, some fresh and purple, others faded to yellow, suggesting a pattern of abuse that had occurred over an extended period. And there were injuries that appeared more recent, injuries that told of violence in the final hours or days of his life. Dr. Clemens made careful notes, documenting everything she observed before the body was moved, the temperature of the remains, which would help establish time of death, the condition of the skin, which would tell its own story, the positioning of the limbs, which might indicate how the body had been transported. Every detail might prove important later, might be the key that unlocked the mystery of who this child was and who had done this to him. She estimated that the child had been dead for approximately 48 to 72 hours, though the cool weather had slowed decomposition and made exact timing difficult. Whoever had left him here had done so recently, within the last few days at most. As the morning progressed, the investigation began to take shape. Detective Harris took command of the scene, directing the forensics team as they photographed every inch of the ditch and the surrounding area. Officers canvassed the neighborhood, knocking on doors, asking if anyone had seen anything unusual in recent days. The response was frustratingly familiar. People kept to themselves in this area. They did not pay attention to what happened on the road. They had heard nothing, seen nothing, knew nothing. One elderly woman admitted that she had seen a car pulled over near the ditch 2 nights earlier, but she could not describe the vehicle or the driver. She had thought it was just someone stopping to make a phone call. The garbage bags that had contained the body were carefully collected and cataloged. They were a common brand, sold at grocery stores and hardware shops throughout the county, the kind that could be found in 1 million homes. The clothing the child wore was similarly generic, offering no obvious clues to his identity. There was no wallet, no identification, no note from a parent or guardian explaining who he was or why he had ended up in this terrible place. By noon, the body had been transported to the DeKalb County Medical Examiner's office, where a full autopsy would be performed. The scene at Snapfinger Road had been thoroughly processed, every piece of potential evidence collected and documented, and Detective Harris sat in his car at the edge of the crime scene, staring at the empty ditch where a child had been found, wondering who he was. That afternoon, the autopsy confirmed what the preliminary examination had suggested, and worse. The child had suffered extensive abuse over a prolonged period. There were healed fractures in his arms and ribs, evidence of injuries that had occurred months or even years before his death. His body bore the marks of malnutrition and neglect, conditions that pointed to a life of sustained suffering. Dr. Clemens dictated her findings into a recorder, her voice professional and detached, even as she documented horrors that would give most people nightmares. Multiple healed fractures of the left radius, suggesting repeated trauma. Evidence of old rib fractures, at least 3, in various stages of healing. Signs of chronic malnutrition, including stunted growth and vitamin deficiencies. Scarring consistent with burns on the arms and back, some healed, others more recent. The cause of death was determined to be blunt force trauma to the head. Someone had struck this child with tremendous force, causing a skull fracture and brain hemorrhage. The injuries were not survivable. The manner of death was ruled a homicide. When Dr. Clemens reached the section where she had to estimate the child's age, her voice cracked slightly despite her years of practice. Based on dental development and bone structure, she estimated the child was between 5 and 7 years old. A boy who should have been learning to ride a bicycle, playing with friends, looking forward to summer vacation. Instead, he had lived a life of pain and died a death of violence, and no one had even known he was missing. The task of identifying the child fell to Detective Harris and his partner, Detective Michelle Torres. Torres was younger than Harris by nearly 2 decades, a 32-year-old former Army MP who had joined the department 5 years earlier. She was sharp, thorough, and possessed the kind of empathy that made her effective with witnesses while still maintaining the emotional distance necessary to do the job. They began with the obvious approaches. They checked missing persons reports for DeKalb County and the surrounding areas, looking for any child matching the description, any report that might have been filed in the last weeks or months. They reached out to local schools to see if any students had suddenly stopped attending, any child who had vanished without explanation. They contacted Child Protective Services to see if any children in their system had gone missing, any cases that might connect to their victim. The results were disheartening. There were no missing persons reports that matched the child's description. No schools reported a student matching his age and physical characteristics as absent. Child Protective Services had no record of a child who fit the profile, at least none that was currently unaccounted for. It was as if the boy had never existed at all, as if he had materialized from nowhere only to die in a ditch on a quiet Georgia road. "How does a child just disappear?" Torres asked, frustration evident in her voice as they reviewed the lack of leads. "Someone has to be missing him. A parent, a teacher, a neighbor, someone." Harris shook his head, his face grim. Not if he was never really seen to begin with, not if he was already invisible. As the days passed, the investigation expanded. The police held a press conference, releasing a composite sketch of what the child might have looked like in life. The sketch showed a young African-American boy with round cheeks and wide eyes, a face that could have belonged to any of thousands of children in the county. They pleaded with the public for information, for anyone who might recognize the boy to come forward. The local news covered the story extensively. The image of the sketch appeared on every channel, accompanied by details of where and how the child had been found. Anchors spoke in solemn tones about the tragedy, about the community's responsibility to protect its children, about the hope that someone would come forward with information. The response was overwhelming in its heartbreak, but useless in its practicality. Hundreds of calls came in from concerned citizens, from people who thought they might have seen the child somewhere, from grieving parents of missing children who hoped and feared in equal measure that this might be their child. Each lead was followed up, each possibility investigated, and one by one they were eliminated. The child remained unidentified. In the weeks following the discovery, the community around Snapfinger Road struggled to come to terms with what had happened. A makeshift memorial appeared at the edge of the ditch where the boy had been found. Stuffed animals accumulated first, teddy bears and plush dogs left by strangers who felt compelled to mark the spot. Flowers followed, bouquets that wilted in the spring sun and were replaced by fresh ones. Handwritten notes appeared, messages to a child no one had known. "Rest in peace, little angel," one note read. "Someone loves you, even if we never knew your name." Local churches held prayer vigils. Pastors spoke from pulpits about the importance of looking out for children in the community, about being willing to report concerns, about not turning away from suffering. Schools talked to their students about the importance of telling a trusted adult if they or someone they knew was being hurt. Civic organizations raised money for a reward, hoping that the promise of cash might loosen tongues that had remained silent. But the silence held. Whoever had killed this child, whoever had wrapped him in garbage bags and dumped him like trash, remained free. And the child himself remained nameless, known only by the case number assigned to him by the DeKalb County Police Department. As spring turned to summer in 1999, the intensity of the investigation began to wane. Not because the detectives had given up, but because there were other cases, other victims, other families demanding justice. DeKalb County, like many urban and suburban areas, in the late 1990s, dealt with its share of violent crime. Resources were limited, and the living often took priority over the dead. Detective Harris kept the file on his desk, a constant reminder of the promise he had made. He added to it occasionally when a new lead came in, but the leads grew fewer and further between. Tips that seemed promising turned into dead ends. Potential matches to missing children from other jurisdictions were investigated and eliminated. The case, despite Harris's determination, was growing cold. The child was buried on a warm Saturday in late April in a county cemetery on the outskirts of Atlanta. The plot was purchased with donations from the community, money that had poured in from people who had never met the child but felt they could not let him go to his final rest without some acknowledgement of his existence. The headstone read simply, "Baby Boy Doe, beloved child of God, found March 15, 1999. It was not the name his mother had given him, not the identity that had been stolen, along with his life. But it was something. It was a marker that said someone had been here, someone had mattered, someone had been mourned. The funeral was attended by police officers, social workers, and strangers who felt they could not let a child go to his rest without witnesses. Detective Harris stood at the edge of the crowd, his jaw set, his eyes fixed on the small casket being lowered into the ground. He was not a religious man, but he found himself offering a silent prayer nonetheless, a promise to the boy in the box that this was not the end. He made a commitment that day, one he shared with no one but himself. He would not forget this child. He would not give up. No matter how long it took, no matter what obstacles arose, he would find out who this boy was and who had killed him. It was a promise that would take more than 2 decades to fulfill. The years that followed were marked by periodic bursts of activity. Every few months, Detective Harris would pull out the file, review the evidence, and reach out to new agencies or databases that might hold the key. DNA technology was advancing rapidly during this period, and he made sure that samples from the child were preserved and cataloged, hoping that someday the science would catch up to the mystery. In 2001, the case was featured on a national television program dedicated to unsolved crimes. The segment included the composite sketch, an interview with Detective Harris, and a plea for anyone with information to come forward. The episode generated hundreds of tips. Callers who thought they recognized the child, who remembered seeing a boy matching his description in their neighborhood or town. Each tip was investigated, and each led nowhere. In 2003, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children took an interest in the case. Their forensic artists created an updated composite image, using the latest techniques to show what the child might have looked like in life. The new image was distributed widely, appearing on the center's website and in materials sent to law enforcement agencies across the country. Still, no one came forward to claim him. In 2005, Detective Raymond Harris retired from the DeKalb County Police Department. At his retirement party, surrounded by colleagues who praised his decades of service, he spoke briefly about the cases that still haunted him. The child from Snapfinger Road was at the top of that list. "We owe that boy a name," Harris said, his voice rough with emotion. "We owe him justice, and I'm not going to stop looking just because I'm no longer carrying a badge." True to his word, Harris continued to work the case in his retirement. He partnered with volunteer organizations dedicated to identifying unknown remains. He attended conferences on cold cases and forensic technology. He reached out to genealogists who were beginning to use DNA to solve mysteries that had stymied traditional investigation. The years continued to pass. The 10th anniversary of the child's death came and went. Then the 15th. Then the 20th. The memorial at Snapfinger Road had long since been cleared away, the site now indistinguishable from any other stretch of roadside. But in filing cabinets and computer databases, the evidence remained, waiting for the moment when science and determination would finally intersect. That moment came in 2021. The field of forensic genetic genealogy had undergone a revolution in the years since the child's body was found. What had once seemed like science fiction was now routine practice. DNA samples could be uploaded to genealogy databases, matched against family trees that had been constructed by millions of users around the world. Criminals who had evaded justice for decades were being identified and captured. And unnamed victims were finally being given back their identities. Detective Michelle Torres, who had worked the case alongside Harris in 1999 and had since risen to the rank of lieutenant, decided that the time had come to apply these new techniques to the child from Snapfinger Road. She had never forgotten the case, had thought about that little boy every time she drove past the spot where he had been found. Now, with technology that had not existed when the crime occurred, she saw a chance to finally fulfill the promise her former partner had made. Torres reached out to Othram, a private laboratory based in Texas that specialized in forensic genetic genealogy. Othram had developed techniques for extracting DNA from degraded and contaminated samples, the kind of evidence that had been collected decades earlier, when preservation methods were less sophisticated. They had solved cases that had been cold for 40, 50, even 60 years. The samples from the child were retrieved from the evidence warehouse where they had been stored for more than 2 decades. Despite the passage of time, the forensic team at Othram was optimistic. The samples had been kept in controlled conditions, and the original collection had been thorough enough to preserve usable genetic material. The process was painstaking. The scientists at Othram extracted what genetic information they could from the samples, using techniques that had not existed when the evidence was first collected. They built a DNA profile, then uploaded it to genealogy databases where it could be compared against millions of other profiles submitted by people tracing their family histories. The search took months. The genetic matches that came back were distant, cousins several times removed, whose connection to the child required careful genealogical work to establish. But slowly, methodically, a picture began to emerge. The child had relatives in the Atlanta area. His family tree included branches that led to DeKalb County, to the very area where his body had been found. The genealogists at Othram, led by a researcher named Dr. Sarah Chen, worked backwards through the family trees of the genetic matches. They consulted public records, obituaries, census data, anything that might help them narrow down the identity of the child. It was like solving a puzzle where most of the pieces were missing, but Chen and her team were experienced at this kind of work. In early 2022, they made a breakthrough. The DNA analysis pointed strongly to a woman named Terry Hamilton as a close relative of the child. Further research revealed that Hamilton had given birth to a son in September 1992, a boy named William DaShawn Hamilton. The birth records matched the estimated age of the child. The geographic connections aligned perfectly, and when investigators compared photographs of William as a toddler to the remains of the child from Snapfinger Road, the resemblance was unmistakable. After 23 years, the child had a name. Lieutenant Torres received the news in her office at the DeKalb County Police Department. She sat in silence for a long moment after reading the report, the weight of 2 decades finally lifting from her shoulders. Then she picked up the phone and called Raymond Harris, now 70 years old, and still waiting for news about the case that had haunted him for so long. "We got him, Ray," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "We found out who he was. His name is William DaShawn Hamilton." On the other end of the line, Harris was silent for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "William," he said. "His name is William." The identification was just the beginning. With a name came a family, and with a family came a history. Investigators began the work of reconstructing William DaShawn Hamilton's short life, interviewing relatives, reviewing records, piecing together the story of a child who had been failed by everyone who should have protected him. What they found was a tale of almost incomprehensible neglect and cruelty. William had been born into chaos and had never known anything else. His mother, Terry Hamilton, had struggled with addiction and mental health issues throughout his life. The men who moved in and out of her household had been uniformly unstable, some of them violent. And William, small and vulnerable, had been at the mercy of adults who should have been his protectors. The records painted a damning picture. There had been reports to Child Protective Services, allegations of neglect and abuse that had been investigated and closed without meaningful action. William had fallen through the cracks of a system that was overwhelmed and underfunded, a system that too often gave parents the benefit of the doubt at the expense of their children. But the most important question remained unanswered. Who had killed William DaShawn Hamilton? Who had beaten a 6-year-old boy so severely that he died, wrapped his body in garbage bags, and dumped him in a ditch? The investigation focused quickly on the adults who had been in William's life at the time of his disappearance. His mother, Terry Hamilton, was located and brought in for questioning. She was now in her early 50s, living in a housing project on the south side of Atlanta, her face marked by years of hard living, her demeanor a mixture of defensiveness and resignation. The interview room was small and stark, equipped with recording equipment that would capture every word. Lieutenant Torres conducted the interview, her manner calm but persistent. She had waited more than 20 years for this moment, and she was not going to let it slip away. At first, Terry claimed not to remember William clearly. It had been so long ago, she said. There had been so many years, so much chaos. Her memory wasn't what it used to be. But as the detectives pressed her, as they showed her photographs of William as a toddler and images of his remains, her story began to shift. She admitted that William had lived with her in 1999. She admitted that Brian Bell, her boyfriend at the time, had been in the household, and she admitted, haltingly, that there had been violence. But she insisted that she had not been responsible for William's death. That was Brian, she said. Brian had done it. She had been afraid of him, afraid for her own life. She had not been able to stop him. The detectives listened to her story with the skepticism it deserved. They had heard similar stories before, from other parents who had stood by while their children were beaten to death. The claim of fear, the shifting of blame, the insistence that someone else had done the actual killing. It was a familiar pattern, and it rarely told the whole truth. Brian Bell was the next target of the investigation. Locating him proved more difficult than finding Terry Hamilton. In the years since 1999, Bell had moved frequently, never staying in one place for long. He had accumulated a criminal record that included assault, drug possession, domestic violence, and theft. He was exactly the kind of man who might beat a child to death, and exactly the kind of man who had spent decades evading consequences for his actions. When investigators finally tracked Bell down, he was living in a run-down apartment complex in Macon, Georgia, about an hour south of Atlanta. He was 64 years old now, his body showing the wear of a life spent in pursuit of self-destruction. His hair had gone gray, his face was lined and sunken, but his eyes still held the same hardness that those who knew him had always feared. When the police knocked on his door, he seemed almost unsurprised, as if he had been waiting for this moment for a very long time. He let them in without protest, sat down at his kitchen table, and asked what had taken them so long. The interrogation of Brian Bell lasted several hours. Unlike Terry, who had been evasive and defensive, Bell was combative, aggressive, prone to outbursts that required the detectives to pause and let him calm down. But beneath the aggression, there was something else. A weariness, perhaps, a desire to finally set down a burden he had been carrying for more than 2 decades. Over the course of the interview, Brian Bell confessed to killing William DaShawn Hamilton. The story he told was both horrifying and depressingly predictable. William had been a difficult child, Bell said, using the language of abusers throughout history to justify the unjustifiable. He cried too much. He wet the bed. He was always underfoot, always needing something. Bell had hit him before many times, and William had always survived. But on that day, in March 1999, something had gone differently. Bell described the day in fragments, his memory selective in ways that seemed designed to minimize his own culpability. William had done something wrong, he said. He couldn't remember exactly what. Maybe he had spilled something, or broken something, or just been in the wrong place at the wrong time. Bell had lost his temper, as he had lost it so many times before. He had grabbed William, shaken him, struck him. The boy had fallen, hitting his head on the corner of a table or the edge of a counter. Bell couldn't remember exactly. William had been unconscious, blood seeping from a wound on his head. Bell had panicked. He had tried to wake the boy, but William wouldn't respond. By the time he realized how serious it was too late. Bell described the hours that followed in chilling detail. He and Terry had waited to see if William would wake up, would recover, as he had recovered from other beatings. But the child remained still, his breathing growing shallower, his skin growing cold. By the time they realized he was dead, it was too late to call for help, too late to pretend it had been an accident. They had wrapped him in garbage bags, Bell said, because that was what they had available. They had driven to Snap Finger Road in the middle of the night. found a ditch that seemed remote enough, and left him there. Then they had returned home and waited for someone to notice that William was gone. But no one had noticed. No one had reported him missing. No one had asked questions. The days had turned to weeks, and the weeks to months, and eventually Belle and Terry had convinced themselves that they had gotten away with it. They had moved on with their lives, such as they were, while William rotted in a ditch and was eventually buried under a headstone that bore a name that was not his own. The confession was damning, but the investigation did not stop there. Forensic evidence corroborated many of the details Belle had provided. The garbage bags found with William's body were consistent with a brand that had been sold in the area where Belle and Terry had lived. The injuries documented in the autopsy were consistent with the kind of violence Belle described inflicting. And DNA evidence, the same technology that had finally given William his name, helped establish the connections that made the case against Belle airtight. Terry Hamilton was also arrested and charged. While Belle had been the one to deliver the fatal blow, investigators determined that Terry had been a willing participant in the abuse that preceded William's death. She had witnessed the violence for years, had done nothing to stop it, had helped to dispose of her own son's body. Under Georgia law, her culpability was clear. The legal proceedings that followed were lengthy and complex. Both defendants were represented by attorneys who mounted vigorous defenses. Belle's attorney argued that his client had been coerced into confessing, that the evidence was circumstantial, that more than 2 decades of time had made any certainty impossible. Terry's attorney painted her as a victim of domestic violence, a woman who had been too afraid of Brian Bell to protect her son or herself. The jury was not persuaded. In the summer of 2023, after a trial that lasted several weeks, Brian Bell was convicted of first-degree murder in the death of William DaShawn Hamilton. The evidence presented at trial painted a comprehensive picture of a man who had abused a child for years and had ultimately beaten him to death. Bell sat stone-faced as the verdict was read, showing no emotion, offering no apology. The sentencing hearing that followed was emotional. Relatives of William, who had known him briefly as a toddler, spoke about the child he had been, the life he had deserved, the future that had been stolen from him. His grandmother, Dorothy, now in her 80s and frail but determined to be present, wept as she described her regret for not doing more to protect her grandson. Detective Raymond Harris, now 72 years old, but still sharp and determined, testified about the decades-long investigation and the promise he had made to give William his name. His voice broke as he addressed the court, describing the little boy he had found in a ditch more than 2 decades earlier, and the commitment he had made to never forget him. Judge Patricia Montgomery, who presided over the trial, addressed Bell directly before pronouncing sentence. "You took the life of a child who depended on you for protection," she said, her voice steady but filled with barely contained fury. "You subjected him to years of abuse, and when you finally killed him, you discarded his body like garbage. You showed him no dignity in life, and you showed him no dignity in death. And then you walked free for more than 20 years while his body lay in an unmarked grave." She sentenced Brian Bell to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Terry Hamilton's trial followed several months later. The case against her was different in some ways, requiring prosecutors to prove not that she had struck the fatal blow, but that she had been complicit in the abuse and the cover-up that followed. The evidence of her complicity was overwhelming. She had lived in the same household where William was being abused. She had witnessed the violence. She had helped to dispose of the body. And she had spent more than 2 decades saying nothing, doing nothing, as her son lay unidentified and unknown. Her defense attorney argued that Terry was a victim too, that Brian Bell had controlled her through fear and violence, that she had been incapable of protecting William because she could not even protect herself. There was some evidence to support this argument. Terry had been the victim of domestic violence at various points in her life. She had struggled with addiction and mental health issues that had made her vulnerable to manipulation. But the jury ultimately concluded that her victimhood did not excuse her complicity. She had been an adult. William had been a child. And whatever fear she had felt, it did not justify her participation in his death and her silence in the years that followed. Terry Hamilton was convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to 30 years in prison. She will be in her 80s before she is eligible for parole. The resolution of the case brought a measure of closure to those who had spent years searching for answers. Detective Raymond Harris, speaking to reporters after the verdicts, said that he felt a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. "I made a promise to that boy 23 years ago," Harris said, his voice thick with emotion. "I promised him that I would find out who he was and who did this to him. It took longer than I wanted, but we got there. William DaShawn Hamilton has his name back, and the people who killed him are finally facing justice." The community that had mourned an unknown child in 1999 gathered once more in 2023, this time to honor William by his true name. A new headstone was placed on his grave, replacing the marker that had read Baby Boy Doe for so many years. The new stone bore his full name, his date of birth, his date of death, and a simple inscription, "Finally home." The ceremony was attended by dozens of people, some who had known William, many who had never met him, but felt connected to his story. There were tears and prayers and the kind of communal grief that brings strangers together in shared sorrow. And there was something else, too, a sense of resolution, of a story that had finally found its ending. But even as the community celebrated the resolution of the case, difficult questions lingered. How had a child been killed and discarded without anyone noticing his absence? How had his killers walked free for more than 2 decades? What had gone wrong in the systems that were supposed to protect vulnerable children like William? The answers to these questions were uncomfortable to consider. William had fallen through the cracks because there were too many cracks to begin with. The social services system in Georgia, like systems throughout the country, was overwhelmed and underfunded. Caseworkers carried impossibly heavy loads. Reports of abuse were investigated by people who had neither the time nor the resources to conduct thorough examinations. And children like William, who lived in unstable households and attended no schools, could simply vanish without triggering any alarms. In the years since William's identification, advocates have used his case to push for reforms. They have called for better funding for child protective services, for more rigorous investigation of abuse allegations, for systems that track children who are not enrolled in schools. Some of these reforms have been implemented. Others remain mired in political and budgetary battles. What is clear is that William DaShawn Hamilton's death was preventable. If the adults in his life had protected him, he would have lived. If the systems designed to catch falling children had worked, he would have been rescued. If any of the dozens of people who crossed paths with William in his short life had spoken up, had asked questions, had demanded answers, his story might have ended differently, but they did not. And so, a little boy died in pain and fear, was discarded like garbage, and lay unnamed for more than 2 decades while his killers walked free. The story of William DaShawn Hamilton is in many ways a story of failure. The failure of his family to love and protect him. The failure of his community to notice his suffering. The failure of systems that were supposed to be his safety net. These failures compounded upon each other, creating a tragedy that was both specific to William and representative of countless other children whose stories never make the news. But it is also a story of persistence. Detective Raymond Harris never gave up, even when the case seemed hopeless, even when years turned to decades, even when he had long since retired from the force. The forensic genealogists at Othram worked painstakingly to extract information from degraded samples, to build family trees from distant matches, to give a name to a child who had been anonymous for too long. The prosecutors who took the case to trial did so knowing that more than 20 years had passed, that evidence had degraded, that witnesses had died or forgotten, and they pressed forward anyway. This persistence matters, not just because it brought justice to William, but because it sends a message to anyone who might contemplate harming a child. The message is simple. We will not forget. We will not give up. No matter how long it takes, no matter how cold the case grows, we will keep searching until we find the truth. William DaShawn Hamilton was 6 years old when he died. He never learned to read. He never made friends at school. He never experienced the simple pleasures that should be the birthright of every child. His life was short and painful, marked by abuse and neglect from the very people who should have cherished him. But in death, he has become something more. He has become a symbol of the children who fall through the cracks, a reminder of our collective responsibility to protect the most vulnerable among us. His case has inspired reforms and renewed dedication to the cause of child welfare, and his name, finally spoken after 23 years of silence, serves as a rebuke to those who thought they could harm a child and escape consequences. In the end, William DaShawn Hamilton was not forgotten. He was not abandoned. A community of strangers came together to give him dignity in death that he had been denied in life. They fought for him, mourned for him, and ultimately achieved justice for him. That is the legacy of William DaShawn Hamilton. That is the story that we tell. As we close this chapter, we are reminded of the words that Detective Harris spoke at the first funeral, the one where William was buried under a headstone that bore no name. "We owe that boy," Harris said. "We owe him a name. We owe him justice." 23 years later, that debt has been paid. But our work is not done. Somewhere, right now, there are other children suffering in silence. Other children being hurt by the people who should protect them. Other children who might one day end up in ditches, wrapped in garbage bags, waiting for someone to give them names. We owe those children too. Thanks for being here and listening. Don't forget to hit the bell for our latest stories. Stay safe and take care with your loved ones.